formulaic to begin a conference speech by saying what an honour it is to have been invited, but for me, here in the offices of the Institute of Economic Affairs, that's no mere platitude. I am truly honoured to be here, having followed the activities of the IEA since I was a student back in the early 80s. And of course, that was a very exciting time, and you were making the political weather. But I have to say I was particularly impressed by what had preceded that, the preceding decades, when in your wilderness years you were a lone, principled and brave voice pointing the way. I'm proud to say that in my bookshelves at home I have a number of your research papers from that time by iconic figures such as Hayek and Milton Friedman and your own Lord Harris. And it's an immense privilege to be able to contribute in this very small way to your deliberations today. When I was a student in the early 80s, I hadn't heard of our other co-hosts, the ITIF, Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, for the simple reason that it was another quarter of a century before it was established. But I understand that the ITIF is concerned with the interrelation between technology, new technologies, and public policy, and that is really a very good basis for our discussions today. So to both the IEA and the ITIF, can I thank you very much for having invited me to join you today. All that said, I'm conscious that being a representative of a public authority that intervenes in market dynamics isn't exactly a passport to popularity with this audience. And I know that many will feel that, like other regulators, we intervene in perfectly flourishing markets that would do better without that intervention. Unintended consequences, the road to hell being paved with good intentions and so on, and that we are suppressing, and particularly in the kind of technological markets we're talking about, we are suppressing dynamism and entrepreneurialism and innovation with the dead hand of the state. So if I can just begin by saying what we are about as a competition authority at the CMA, at the Competition and Markets Authority. If you don't mind, I'm going to start with a couple of basics, and I apologise because I know that this is a pretty sophisticated audience, and what I'm about to say will be obvious to many of you, but I sometimes think that in the immense complexity of the work we all do, it's often good to be reminded of the obvious and the basic. And the first basic point is this, that market competition is a tremendous force for good. It benefits us all as individuals, and it benefits us as a society. It provides us as consumers, it's the best mechanism for providing us as purchasers of goods and services with value for money. And that's because if a business is faced with effective competition, the only way it's going to make money is by not losing its customers to its competitors. And the only way it will do that is by treating its customers well, by not raising prices too high, by offering them good quality. So effective market competition offers downward pressure on price, upward pressure on quality. And because that's a continuing dynamic, and you don't want to lose your customers to your competitors, and they don't want to lose their customers to you, you're forever trying to leapfrog, and there is an incentive to innovate in better quality offerings, better quality products and services, and to innovate in being more cost efficient, so you can forever keep the value for money and the prices going down. all of us benefit as buyers of goods and services from the downward pressure on price, the upward pressure on quality, the innovation and the cost efficiency that market competition brings. And more than that, because of the incentive to cost efficiency, businesses become more efficient, the economy becomes more productive, and that is a route to economic growth and ultimately to job creation. So as individuals and as a society, we all benefit from market competition. So that's the first basic point, and I told you it was fairly obvious. The second basic point is that left to themselves, businesses like to be protected from competition. And why wouldn't they? It's much cozier not to have to cut your prices, not to have to invest in quality. And this was pointed out by Adam Smith. He gave an example where businesses frustrated competition by agreeing not to compete with each other, by agreeing not to compete on price, by carving up the market, and he saw that that replaced that downward pressure on price with an upward pressure on price. And the words he used in The Wealth of Nations, which I know a lot of you are familiar with, but are worth, I think, repeating, is that people of the same trade, so competitors, people of the same trade seldom meet together, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. And that's one way in which businesses left to themselves can frustrate competition. Another is if they acquire market power. Now, market power is basically being in such a strong position in any market that you're no longer afraid, however you behave, of losing your customers to your competitors. And if that fear goes, then the incentive that I talked about that gives an incentive to a downward pressure on price and an upward pressure on quality, that goes, and left to themselves with an incentive to replace competition by market power or by collusion, all the benefits of market competition that we discussed for individuals and for society are put at risk. Now, how is all of that relevant to what we're talking about today, which is the digital economy, the new economy? Well, let me say at once that even though we possibly don't say it enough, competition authorities like mine and competition authorities all over the world regard the digital revolution, the emergence of tech companies, as overwhelmingly a force for good. Quite apart from all the other benefits which we're all familiar with, they are good for choice, good for consumers, good for competition, and therefore productive of the kind of benefits we've just been discussing. And if I can give some kind of concrete reality to that, let's talk about one aspect of digital markets that we're all familiar with in our day-to-day life, which is online shopping, e-commerce. Let's think of what the digital revolution has brought us. Through online shopping, it is simply more convenient to get goods and services. You don't have to go out in the rain, you don't have to drive miles. At the click of a mouse, at the touch of a screen, you can get pretty much all you want. And during the pandemic lockdowns, for many, many types of product, that was the only way you could purchase. So it is immensely convenient. It is also, it offers a competitive alternative to bricks and mortar, traditional retail stores, a new competitive pressure. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that the one is necessarily better than the other, but that, as with all aspects of market competition, both benefit, and ultimately the consumers benefit, from this new competition that didn't exist. And they learn from each other. And a practical example is click and collect. There are advantages in bricks and mortar stores. It is easier, frankly, to browse and see exactly what you're buying, feel the clothes, feel the fruit, look at exactly what you're buying. But there are advantages the other way, and the competition between them has forced both to raise their game. And as I said, click and collect is a very good example of that. But more than it making shopping more convenient and easier, the digital revolution in online retailing has made shopping around easier. By shopping around, I mean our ability as consumers to compare goods and services that are on offer. So instead of having to go out from one shop to another until one drops from exhaustion, again, just at the touch of a screen, at the click of a mouse, you can easily compare the prices and the range of products that are on offer. Now that matters not just as a matter of convenience, but because if it is easier to compare and to shop around, then that exerts a more intense competitive pressure on all the businesses in that market. And with that more intense competitive pressure, the incentives to offer a better deal for consumers get even greater. And finally, on this list of benefits of what the online revolution in retailing has brought us, there are two particular features that intensify competition still further. One is online reviews. One can not only easily hop from one offering to another on one screen, but you can see informed consumer comment of the value and quality of the products and services available, and that intensifies competitive pressures. And so too do what we competition authorities rather pompously call digital comparison tools, but most of us know as price comparison websites. You can easily compare the price of what's on offer quickly and easily. And with that information, you are better informed and there is more intense competitive pressure. So all these features act in favour of competition, therefore in favour of downward pressure on price, upward pressure on quality, innovation, and us all as consumers. So what's not to like? Well, let's go back to what Adam Smith said. Left to themselves, businesses have, there is a danger that competition, effective competition between businesses will be frustrated. And there is a real risk, as many of these tech companies have become global giants, that they acquire market power, that they retain market power, and that they entrench market power. And if you remember, I said market power was that state where you're no longer afraid of losing your customers to your competitors. So all those incentives for downward pressure on price, upward pressure on quality evaporate, and we are all worse off, and the incentives to efficiency and to innovation also evaporate. So we need to watch out, and as competition authorities, we need to strike a balance and steer a very difficult course between recognising and retaining the immense pro-consumer, pro-competitive benefits of the technological revolution, while not allowing it to overreach so that it frustrates competition and deprives us of all the benefits that market competition can offer. Now let me say how the CMA has been dealing with that in real terms. In July 2020, July of last year, we published the results of a market study we had carried out into online platforms and specifically digital advertising. Most of you will know that digital advertising is the way that the online platforms finance the free of charge to consumers, or largely free of charge to consumers offerings. And what we found was that two of them in particular, Google in respect of search advertising and Facebook, now Meta, in respect of display advertising, had market power, in fact rather significant market power. So the dangers of that which were there, which I outlined, and that was reinforced by the fact that they were present at various levels of the advertising supply chain, what's in jargon terms known as the ad tech stack. So essentially vertical integration, making it very hard for rivals to come in and offer a competitive challenge to them, and also meaning that they were able to impose exploitative terms and pricing on people at both ends of the markets they served, on the advertisers, the companies that wanted to advertise, and on the content providers, the newspapers and so on, that wanted to receive the adverts. So both ends were losing out because there was limited competition in each of those markets, and that limited competition was being reinforced by that vertical integration. Since then, in the past year, we have opened a number of investigations to see whether some of these companies might be breaching the competition prohibitions on anti-competitive agreements and on abuse of market power, the prohibitions on anti-competitive practices. And in the last few months, we've started looking at Apple to see whether it is by restricting app developers from using any other payment system than that of its own app store, whether that is an anti-competitive practice. We've also looked at Facebook, Meta, to see whether it's by its use of data, it is in some way distorting competition. And I don't want to go into the details of that investigation, but just to give you an idea of what that kind of thing means, not necessarily in this case, but generally. A lot of these platforms receive data from customers, and they receive data from the businesses that interface with them and whose products they act as a platform for reselling. And if they're able to use that data for their own businesses, that is a distortion of competition. So we're looking at that kind of issue, I say that kind of issue, in that investigation. And lastly, we opened a case into Google's proposals for a so-called privacy sandbox. Now, there the concern is, or the issue is, that Google has proposed, as a way of responding to concerns about privacy and the privacy and the exploitation of personal data, they've proposed effectively to abolish third-party cookies, so to limit rivals' access to the data that they get by a privacy sandbox. And there's a balance to be struck between, and we've done that because we think that makes it harder for rivals to compete and entrenches possible market power. And there's a balance to be struck here between the very legitimate privacy considerations and the competition considerations, both of which are relevant to us all as consumers. And in dealing with that, we've worked very constructively with the UK's main privacy regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office. And I'm pleased to say that there are signs that we are reaching resolution, and Google is engaging with us very positively. Now, the difficulty with these kind of competition investigations under the competition prohibitions is that they can take a long time, and they take a long time for very good reasons. One has to amass lots of evidence, one hears lots of arguments, one has to respect the parties' rights of defence and respect due process, but they can take a long time. Now, that's always a bit of a problem, but in fast-moving tech markets, that's a particular problem, because by the time you've addressed any concern, the market power might be entrenched, the rivals may no longer be able to enter the market at all, might have been forced to disappear, and things might have moved on. So faced with that, we, like lots of other competition regimes in the world, are in the position where the government is proposing that there be, in addition to all these competition powers, a form of pro-competition regulatory control of those digital players with strong market power. The jargon word is significant market status, with a view to setting out some rules in advance that they need to comply with to ensure that competition isn't frustrated. And the government has said that it wants the UK version of that, the UK regulator, which it's calling the Digital Markets Unit, to be located within the Competition and Markets Authority. So finally, I'm very aware that hearing all this, there is a strong argument that says, well, if you do all this, you are not rewarding innovation. And if the companies cannot yield the reward of their innovation, the incentives to innovate dry up, and eventually we will all be worse off because we don't get that innovation. Now, I understand that argument. I have some sympathy for it, but I think in this context it's not right. And I said earlier that the competition authorities need to strike a balance, but that's probably not the best way to express it. It's more accurate to say that it is precisely because of the need to give incentives to innovation that we have to be vigilant that tech companies, which started off as challengers and disruptors, and which continue to be capable of offering innovation, are not protected from competition that gives them the incentive to innovate further, and don't create and reinforce and entrench barriers to market entry that make it harder for new competitors, new innovators, new challengers, new disruptors to come in and make their offerings. And it's precisely because we are concerned about protecting innovation that with vigour and determination we will act to ensure that competition is not choked off, that barriers to entry are not raised and entrenched, to the benefit of competition, to the benefit of consumers, to the benefit of all of us as individuals and as society. Thank you very much.
Michael has very kindly agreed to take some questions for a few minutes, so I will open the floor to questions. Sam, you're straight in there.
Thanks very much.
Hello.
Really appreciate you being here. You quoted Adam Smith, who then goes on to say, after the line you quoted, though the law cannot hinder people of the same trade from sometimes assembling together, it ought to do nothing to facilitate such assemblies, much less to render them necessary. Then he goes on to list some regulations that might do that, but they're all pretty out of date now. I've always thought that one of the virtues of the CMA was that it was mostly one shot with respect to the industries it effectively regulated. Unlike sector regulators, it doesn't develop the kind of symbiotic revolving door-style relationship that I think, and I think many people think, can engender a regulatory capture. And I worry that the DMU doesn't have that virtue, that the DMU will end up being much more like a traditional sector regulator and suffer from all of the regulatory capture risks that we usually associate with that. So my question is, do you think that I'm right to worry? And is the CMA concerned about this? And is the CMA doing anything to try to mitigate that?
Yes. Well, you are right to say that the Digital Markets Unit, if it's in the CMA, is a departure for us because it is a regulatory body, and the rest of our activities are not about regulation at all. They are about ensuring that the market is left free without restriction. And this is a regulatory body. It's a pro-competition regulatory body, but yes, it will set rules in advance, ex ante. Now, I've heard lots of criticisms of what it will do from outside parties, but the thought that we will be have regulatory capture, that we will be too favourable towards the tech giants isn't one of them. Well, sorry, that was I don't exactly. I don't want to be flippant about that because it is always a worry, and it is a worry we will need to guard against, and we are very conscious of that. And more than that, I like to think that because it is embedded in a competition authority, which looks at lots of things, that has a wider perspective, that danger is not as acute as it might otherwise be, but it is a real risk, and we will be alive to that.
Mark?
Michael, thank you very much for a presentation which was both highly sympathetic to the market mechanism, but also a great challenge to those of us who are sympathetic to the market mechanism as a solution to most problems. Picking up a bit on Sam's point and the Adam Smith collusion issue. Isn't the really key thing here barriers to entry, not the spot price of market power? By way of example, if Grenfell, Littlewood and Hewson are the only three manufacturers of the COVID-19 vaccine, and we collude together and say we're only going to allow this onto the market at £5,000 a jab, you've got a hell of a problem. Some other people might try and cook up a vaccine in their garage, but we've probably got complete market power between us for a good period of time. However, if Grenfell, Hewson and Littlewood are the main producers of baked beans, it doesn't strike me that collusion particularly matters. Either somebody else will swiftly bring baked beans to market, or people will switch to green beans if we put up the price of baked beans too highly. So might one not argue with regard to the tech sector that if you look at a particular spot price, you know, how many people are using Friends United 10 years ago or whatever it was, how many people are using Facebook today, that you see extreme market power. But because in this sector barriers to entry are so small compared to other industries that one could imagine, this need not cause us much fear that Facebook, if it mistreats its customers, will go the same way as Friends Reunited. Google will go the same way as Netscape Navigator. And if those barriers to entry are low, it's unlikely the collusion would happen. But even if the collusion did happen, it wouldn't much matter. It would unravel swiftly.
Okay. Well, there is a long and respectable tradition that the only competition concern should be the lack of contestability, the factor barriers to entry. And I completely get that. The point about the big tech companies, it is absolutely true that names that were very big 20 years ago, Yahoo, for example, was, you just don't hear of. And it is possible, and has been the case, that challengers have come in and so on. And also certain technologies and ways of doing things have become redundant and new ones have come along. I think the concern that we and many competition authorities and policymakers and commentators have is that actually in these markets a number of barriers to entry have arisen that make it very hard to be contestable. And it is hard partly because of the network effects. I mean, if you are a social media site, people being on it, the more people you have, the stronger you are. It's partly because of brand, it's partly because of the relationships in digital advertising, which are the basic business model of many of these. And I said earlier, our market study found, both for Google and for what was then the Facebook Inc., that there is a degree of vertical integration in that supply chain that makes it extremely difficult for people to break in. So the concern here is about barriers to entry and about reinforcing those barriers to entry. Now, obviously, in each of these cases, and if and when the Digital Markets Unit acquires regulatory powers, we will need to look at these cases on their merits. We don't just assume it, and one would hope that as part of their defence, some of the people we investigate will say, look, it's contestable. The barriers to entry are not as big as you think, and we will look at that very carefully. But our studies so far have shown that there are barriers to entry, and that makes it a concern. I don't know who's first. The two hands.
Matthew?
I'm kind of interested if the CMA's takes a look at some of the, I guess, emerging regulatory barriers to entry in the tech sector. So one substantial one in ad tech, of course, was GDPR, which has been found to be advantageous to the likes of Google and Facebook because they had various permissions. There's also a huge kind of regulatory burdens around GDPR. Another kind of upcoming regulation is the online safety bill that has quite substantial burdens on anyone who might try to contest major social media companies. It just poorly, even if you're a small company with various risk assessments before you're allowed to enter the market in the UK. I think there's a strong argument that that could substantially undermine competition in and on itself without any kind of the natural barriers that you're claiming to. Is that something that concerns you?
Yeah, I mean, clearly barriers to entry can be commercial and they can be regulatory, and one of our statutory duties is to advise ministers, so policymakers, on the competition implications of measures that there are. And you will be pleased and relieved to know that governments consult us from time to time, whether at their initiative or at ours, on the implications of regulation. Now, as we know, and data protection is a brilliant example, and online harms is another example, there are other public policy considerations, some which have to be weighed against competition and barriers to entry, and that's not for us, that's far above us, that's for elected politicians and parliamentarians to weigh up. But we can and we do advise on the competition implications of regulatory interventions, absolutely.
Great, well,
and I think, Philip,
can we squeeze one more question in quickly?
Okay. Thanks. You mentioned how you take into account the extent to which new platforms, digital innovations and so on might allow greater competition because of reviews, better price comparison and that type of thing. I was wondering to what extent you take into account the possibility of these innovations radically reducing barriers to entry in unrelated markets. So back in the late 1990s, if you wanted to book a hotel, you either had to have a little yellow AA book, the hotel would be part of a chain, or it would be a very ancient establishment. Now anybody can open a bed and breakfast hotel and very rapidly enter what was previously a pretty closed market.
well, we do think that. We do think that both online review sites and price comparison sites absolutely have those pro-competition effects across a range of markets. And one of the things I should have said earlier, that the reason that digital markets matter, Mark asked, are they unique and so on. But not only is it a sizable sector or set of sectors in itself, but it underlies almost all other economic activities. It's absolutely critical. And in those ways, it's reduced barriers to entry, it's encouraged competition. Now, that is not to say it is without problems. As we speak, the CMA is in court before the Competition Appeal Tribunal in hearings all this week, where we are defending a decision we made in respect of Compare the Market, where we said that some practices and some contractual clauses imposed by Compare the Market on home insurers on its site restricted price competition. They vigorously contest that, and that's in dispute. So that in price comparison sites there are problems. We published a market study a few years ago suggesting that there were other problems in price comparison websites, digital comparison tools. And online review sites are great, and as long as you can trust them, as long as people don't write fake reviews and don't don't suppress critical or negative reviews. Unfortunately, there are cases of that. There have even been cases where on Facebook you can go and find groups of people who trade in fake reviews, and using our consumer protection powers, we have tried to tackle that, and we've worked very well with Facebook and with other sites, and we've got some other investigations ongoing. So these are all fantastic benefits from the technological revolution, but as with all the other things I was talking about, there is potential for abuse, and we need to be vigilant about that.
Right, that really is all we have time for, because Michael, I know you have to run off to the rest of your very busy schedule. So thank you very much
for
your presentation.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.